biblical bookmark comes to us from Exodus 15:23. And its title can be, Where Do You Draw Your Water From? First, I would like to begin by reading Exodus 15:23. Let's start at 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? Well, Moses had the answer. He began to pray. In verse 25, and he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. So we see here that there was a problem. Moses prayed, God gave direction, and he solved the problem for them by providing clean water for them to drink. Verse 26, and said, If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and that will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I have brought upon the Egyptians. For I am the Lord that healeth thee. For I am the Lord that healeth thee. 27. And when they came to Elam, where were 12 wells of water, and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the waters. God cleared the water for these people, and he clears the path for us when we are in trouble. I'd like for you to turn with me into to the book of Psalm, and I would like for us to read together 66 and 10. For thou, O God, hast proved us, thou hast tried us, as silver as tried. And so we need to try and test the waters a little bit, and we'll find that God is faithful, I'm sure. Turn now with me to Psalms 106, and let's read verse 13, because this is what we usually do to the Lord as soon as he makes good on a promise and provides for us. They soon forgot his works. They waited not for his counsel. Isn't this exactly what we do? We try to take care of things ourselves, and we often leave God out. The first 21 verses of Exodus 15 is a song of celebration from Moses and his people to God for parting the Red Sea and for delivering them from the Egyptians. In verse 21, we see the celebration coming to an end. For example, Exodus 15:21 says, And Miriam answered them, Sing ye to the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. For days now the Israelites have been praising the Lord for their deliverance from the Egyptians. And I want you to notice here in verse 22, things change. Moses has to take his people from the Red Sea into the wilderness of Shur. The wilderness of Shur is a dry land, and Moses's people, they are not wanting to move. But I imagine watching the Red Sea part, crossing to the other side, and witnessing all of your enemies drown in the water would create a sense of well-being. And sometimes when we have this sense of well-being, we want to stay there because it's our comfort zone. The people of Israel were smart enough to figure out that if they would turn back to the land of Egypt, they could claim the land for themselves, have plenty of water, and be very prosperous. But that wasn't the plan God had for them. Similarly, many times as Christians, we want to test the waters ourselves. We often want to return to the familiar springs of our old lives. And it's hard to push forward to the new springs. But God's new spring, a fresh water, always is better for us. So don't run back to the old springs. Seek ye out the straight path and move forward. Don't look back. Right off the bat, the Israelites were faced with no water for 3 days, it says in verse 23. I imagine that it did not take 1 million people or more and all of their livestock a long time to consume the amount of water that they could carry from the Red Sea. In this world, there are many springs, and oftentimes we drink from the wrong well. Drawing water from the spring sometimes will make us sick. For example, if we were walking in the wilderness, we must not drink dirty, unclean water because it'll give us the runs. Here in passage 25 of this scripture, God gave Moses a direction, and he followed it. God showed Moses the perfect tree, and he told him to cast the tree into the water, and God made the water run clean to drink. I believe that this tree is a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, because he hung on the tree of life, and all that accepts his running water that wells up inside of us runs clean. We are blameless before God. Then in verse 26, God made the promise that if his people would listen to him, follow his statutes and his laws, that he would keep them healthy. Therefore, Jesus is the source of water that brings life, and all other sources of water bring death to the soul. The springs of Satan will bring sin and poison into our lives. God has a plan for each one of us. His plan here for Moses and the Israelites was to bring them through the desert so that he could teach them the ways of the Lord, give them the laws, and teach him all that is good. This is exactly what happens when we become a Christian. This is why we can't return to the springs that we're used to, because God has a relationship to build with each one of us. God brought his children to the brink of death so he could give them survival. He gives us life more abundant. He allowed them to use all of their natural resources just so they would look up and see that God is always in control and that he will provide their basic needs. Can you imagine walking through the wilderness for 3 days without any water? Being physically and mentally sick, and then seeing what you think might be clean water, and it turns out to be a mirage? Isn't that the way our plans work out sometimes in life? Sometimes, I know for me, once I was saved, I learned what really bitter water was, and I learned how sick my soul was. But now that I have fresh water, and I've tasted the water that Jesus freely gives, there's no reason to turn back. There's no better water that you can experience, but that flows freely from the throne room of God. According to verse 24, just like the first 5 out of 6 chapters or so of Exodus, the Israelites began to grumble and complain. This is exactly what we do in our life. People with a bitter heart sometimes feel as though their works for God outdo the works God does in return. In other words, it's a tit for tat. It's a scoreboard, if you will. Have you ever been around someone who goes about doing good, but always requires something in return? Doesn't that defeat the purpose? When we receive the spirit of grumbling, we are not thankful for anything. A grumbling spirit makes comments, mostly, in a low tone toward another person, or in this case, God. The spirit of grumbling is a danger zone. And we can learn this from the Israelites because they spent 40 years zigzagging through the wilderness instead of coming out on the other side in a timely manner. A result from a grumbling spirit is that of the spirit of bitterness. Bitterness can be described as taking a big gulp of water, only to realize that it is full of sand and minerals and not good to drink. Sometimes we swallow it with pain, while other times we reject the situation. Therefore, we can say that we have a spring of bitterness in our heart. When we have a root of bitterness, the meanness that spews out of our mouth can lead to envy, which can lead to strife, which can lead to demolish relationships and marriages. The spring here in the book of Exodus is full of the wrong substances in verse 23, and the germs could kill them. This whole world is full of springs that could kill you, and this is why we need the healing power of Jesus. Do you know how you can tell a good spring, the good spring of living water, from that of the bad spring of living water that lives inside of you? Well, Luke 6:43 through 45 warns us of 2 different types of fruit. We can say that it's 2 different types of springs as well. But in Luke chapter 6, verses 43, it states, "For the good tree bringeth not forth corrupt fruit, neither doeth a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. For every tree is known by his own fruit. For of the thorns men do not gather figs, nor of a bramble bush gather they grapes. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. For the abundance of the heart is the mouth that speaketh. And why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not know these things which I say?" Well, good fruit and bad fruit. He also says that what goes in a man is not as important as what comes out of a man that makes the man unclean. It's the unclean expressions that come out of a person's mouth that makes them seem unsaved. It is the only one who speaks goodness and mercy that is perceived as being a Christian. Which one are you today? Are you a spring for Christ, or are you a spring of envy, bitter? My friend, don't feel bad if you're a strange spring today, because today presents you with a brand new opportunity. We are born into sin. It is nothing that we have done per se, but because of Adam, we are all sinners. It's because of sin that bitterness exists in the world today. It's because of sin that we have springs of sickness, springs of disease, springs of decay. But the root of each evil spring is Satan. Matthew 6:24 instructs us that we can only have one spring, the spring of the Lord or the spring of Satan. If you open your heart and allow Jesus in today, you can have a spring of living water. Your well of the living water will last eternity. 2 Corinthians 6:2 states, "Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." Therefore, today is the day of salvation. Wait no longer to get your spring. This living water that you will drink today will give you everlasting life. God bless you, and amen. Until the next time we meet through the waves of the radio, why won't you check out our ministry on YouTube? You may also visit us on the web at www.findinghealingingodsbackyard.com. Check out our blog for updates and more Bible study information at www.findinghealingingodsbackyard.blog.